dust was constant, suffocating companion in the town of Oakhaven. It coated the peeling paint of the general store, settled on the worn leather of saddles, and tasted like pulverized grief on the tongue. But it was the silence, heavier than any dust cloud, that was truly terrifying. For 18-year-old Elara, Oakhaven was not a home. It was a cage made of drying timber and forgotten promise, a place where the sun was a ruthless judge and the land offered nothing but endless, barren scrutiny. Elara's world was defined by the ranch she stood upon, the last viable spread for 100 miles, known simply as the Barren Heart. It was a cruel name, one her father, a man ground down to fine powder by years of drought and debt, had ironically given it. Yet the ranch still held its water rights, a miracle of geography and old-world contracts, and that water made it the single most valuable and most coveted thing in the entire valley. That evening, the silence was broken by the sharp, decisive sound of a polished boot crunching on the gravel outside the porch. Elara, stirring a thin broth over a sputtering flame, instinctively moved to the shadowed corner of the kitchen. Her father, Silas, sat slumped at the kitchen table, his face a roadmap of failure and exhaustion. He didn't need to look up to know who had arrived. Only one man in Oakhaven wore boots that clean, carried that much authority, and inspired that degree of cold dread. "He's early," Silas mumbled, his voice a dry rasp. "Don't let him see you, Elara." But it was too late. The towering frame of Caleb Thorne, the owner of the vast, aggressive ranch bordering theirs, filled the doorway. Caleb wasn't just a rancher. He was the institution of the valley, a man who had inherited a fortune built on ruthless acquisition and who had spent the last decade perfecting the art of the legal stranglehold. He was 35, built like a pillar of granite, with eyes the color of a winter storm and a perpetually unreadable expression. Tonight, however, there was a flicker of something in his gaze that Elara had never seen before, a strange mix of reluctance and grim finality. "Silas," Caleb said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate the very air. He didn't ask to come in. He simply was in. The inescapable contract. Elara watched, hidden by the pantry door, as Caleb threw a thick, legal-looking document onto the table. It landed with a puff of dust that made Silas flinch. "The final notice," Caleb announced, his tone purely factual, devoid of either triumph or malice. "The bank has transferred the lien to me, Silas. Your window closed at noon today. The Barren Heart is mine." Silas didn't protest. He just stared at the parchment, the paper becoming a mirror reflecting his defeat. "You could have waited, Caleb, just until the first rain, the forecast." Caleb cut him off with a slow, deliberate shake of his head. "The forecast is a liar, Silas. The valley is dying, and I am not a charity." His eyes, however, did not meet Silas's. They drifted past him, landing on the barely concealed figure in the shadows of the pantry. Elara knew she had been seen. She stepped out, her chin lifted, her slender frame radiating a stubborn defiance that belied her fear. She was dressed in simple, faded denim, but her long, dark hair was tied back with a worn velvet ribbon, and her eyes, a rare, startling shade of amber, held a fierce intelligence that always unnerved the valley's men. "You're a vulture, Mr. Thorne," Elara said, her voice shaking slightly, but steady enough to sting. "You've been waiting for us to choke on the debt, just so you could take the only water source left." Caleb finally met her gaze, and for a long, silent moment, the world shrank down to the charged space between them. His expression hardened, and the strange reluctance was gone, replaced by the mask of the formidable businessman. "I am a survivor, Miss Elara," he corrected her, his eyes cold and assessing. "The difference is I know how to make this land yield, not just how to watch it fail. I offered your father a fair price 2 years ago. He refused." Silas buried his head in his hands. "He did, and I was a fool. The devil's bargain." Elara felt the blood drain from her face. It wasn't the loss of the land she feared. It was the inevitable, crushing destitution that would follow. They had nothing and no one. "There must be another way," she whispered, stepping closer to the table, her hand instinctively resting on her father's shoulder. "A payment plan. A lease." Caleb gave a short, humorless laugh. "There's no payment plan. The debt is astronomical, and the land is forfeit." He leaned against the doorframe, his posture radiating unyielding control. The only thing that could change the outcome is something of equal or greater value to the water rights. He paused, letting the implication hang heavy in the air. He didn't need to state it. But everyone in Oakhaven knew the truth. Caleb Thorne had everything but an heir. His lineage was dying out with him, and his obsession with securing his future, his legacy, was the valley's worst-kept secret. Elara felt a sudden, sickening jolt of understanding, a premonition that made her stomach clench. Her father, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, shot a horrified look at Caleb. "Don't you dare!" Silas spat, pushing himself up from the chair. "You will not involve my daughter in this, Thorne. Take the land. Take the last cow. But you leave her alone." Caleb ignored him completely. His gaze remained locked on Elara, measuring her determination, her intelligence, her sheer, vibrant presence that was so starkly out of place in the desolate ranch house. "I have no interest in your land, Silas," Caleb finally stated, his voice low, almost intimate, meant only for Elara. "Not just the land. I need the future it represents, a connection to this soil that is more than just a deed of sale." He pulled a second, separate document from his inner pocket, a single sheet of heavy parchment, signed and sealed, not by a bank, but by a lawyer and a notary. "This is a legally binding offer," he said, pushing it toward Elara. "I will sign over the Barren Heart deed back to your father. All debt canceled, taxes paid for the next 10 years, a significant cash stipend to get the ranch operational again." Elara's breath hitched. It was a lifeline, a miracle. "And the price?" she managed to ask, though she already knew the answer. The air in the small room had become thick and electric, charged with the momentous, terrible weight of the bargain. Caleb looked at the contract in his hand, then back up at her, and his mask cracked for just a second. He looked tired, older, and profoundly conflicted. His next words were not the calculated demands of a predator, but the quiet, desperate admission of a man trapped by his own empire. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, and he spoke the words that would instantly shatter her world and steal her breath away. "The price, Miss Elara, is this. You will marry me within the month. You will become the mistress of the Thorne estate, and you will give me an heir." He let the silence stretch, the enormity of the demand echoing in the little kitchen. He watched the shock register in her beautiful, amber eyes, and then he delivered the cold, agonizing justification that would forever be seared into her memory. "This is wrong," he said, the words a low, painful confession, but necessary. Necessary to save your father, necessary to save this water for the valley, and necessary to secure my legacy. Elara stared at the document, then at the man. She saw the vast, desolate future of the valley, dust, death, and hunger, if she said no. She looked at her father, whose life was literally in this man's hands. She felt the heavy, terrible weight of the ranch, the debt, the desperation. With a profound, gut-wrenching finality, Elara reached out a trembling hand and picked up the pen. The Barren Heart was saved. Silas, stunned into a mixture of gratitude and crushing guilt, had watched as the enormous Thorne check cleared the debt, and the deeds, clean, clear, and unencumbered, were signed back to him. Elara's sacrifice had worked. 3 weeks later, Elara was no longer the girl of faded denim and dust. She was the unwilling wife of Caleb Thorne, and the new mistress of the Thorne estate, a sprawling, imposing structure of cut stone and dark timber that sat like a silent, watchful monarch on the highest ridge of the valley. It was a palace carved out of the wilderness, intimidating in its wealth and vastness. Her wedding had been a simple, brutal affair, a necessary legal procedure rather than a celebration. Elara wore a gown of heavy, unfamiliar silk, and Caleb wore the same unreadable expression he always did. Yet beneath it, Elara sensed a profound restlessness, a caged discomfort that mirrored her own. On the third night of their marriage, Elara found herself pacing the cavernous master bedroom. It was the only room in the entire estate she truly hated, not because of its opulence, but because it represented the cold reality of their contract. The room was immense, divided by a heavy, carved screen, a physical manifestation of the emotional chasm between them. She was waiting for Caleb. He had spent the last 3 days immersed in ranch business, leaving her alone to navigate the silent, formal staff and the heavy atmosphere of the house. The door finally opened, and Caleb stood there, still in his dust-coated riding gear. He looked weary, but his gaze, as always, was piercing. He didn't approach the screen, instead leaning against the doorframe as he had that night in her kitchen, repeating the scene of the bargain. "You look well, Elara," he said, the use of her first name feeling strange and heavy, like a title she hadn't earned. "I am the mistress of a kingdom," she replied, her voice cool and steady, though her hands were tightly clasped behind her back. "Well should I look." "Content," he murmured, pushing off the frame and slowly walking toward the screen. You saved your father. You secured the water. You paid the price. I expect you to be content with the outcome. Contentment, Elara countered, stepping out from behind the screen and into the main light, forcing him to face her, is a luxury afforded to those who are not sold. The rules of the realm. Caleb stopped short, barely 2 feet away. He was massive, his presence overwhelming, but she refused to step back. You are not sold, Elara, he said, his voice dropping in pitch. You made a choice. A painful, necessary choice. I never deceived you about the terms. The terms, Elara repeated, her eyes blazing, are that I am to provide you with an heir, a son, a continuation of the Thorn dynasty. Is that why you insisted on a screen? To make sure that when you fulfill the final term of our contract, you can pretend the other half of the bed doesn't exist? Caleb's jaw tightened. The screen is for your comfort, he stated rigidly, and the final term, as you call it, is not something I take lightly. He looked away, running a hand over the back of his neck, a gesture of deep frustration she hadn't expected. I know how this looks. I know the position I have put you in. But understand this, Elara. Everything I have done, every land deal, every crushing of an opponent, every long, solitary day, has been for the preservation of this valley's future water source. If the Barren Heart had failed, the drought would have taken us all. My legacy is securing this, not just making money. And your legacy requires a child, Elara challenged. It requires a binding, undeniable connection to this land, he corrected, turning back to her. A legal heir prevents the vultures, worse than me, from tearing the estate apart when I am gone, and the water with it. You understand contracts. You should understand the gravity of that. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and placed it on the nearest mahogany table. Until that time comes, he continued, his tone formal, almost detached, we live by the rules of this house. You are my wife in name, in title, and in appearance. You will preside over the house, manage the accounts, and command the staff. Your authority here is absolute, second only to mine. In public, we are a unified front. In private, we are merely partners in a grim agreement. He looked her straight in the eye, the intensity of his gaze making her heart hammer against her ribs. There's one rule above all others, Elara. You are safe here. My staff is loyal. No one will disrespect you, and I will not touch you until you acknowledge that I am not just a buyer, but a husband who respects the terms of the bargain he forced. The lonesome discovery. The weeks that followed were a cold war fought with polite smiles and purposeful distance. Elara threw herself into the management of the estate, determined to prove that she was more than just a broodmare for the Thorn line. She found the Thorn estate to be a paradox. It was filled with breathtaking art, libraries of ancient texts, and meticulously kept gardens, but it was utterly devoid of joy. Caleb was rarely there, spending his days on the sprawling ranch lands, returning late, often smelling of dust, leather, and rain. One cold afternoon, Elara discovered a hidden room adjoining the large library. It wasn't opulent like the rest of the house. It was small, furnished with worn, comfortable chairs, and lined with personal photographs, not the stern, formal portraits of ancestors that hung in the hallways, but candid snapshots. It was here that Elara saw the other Caleb Thorn. There were pictures of a younger Caleb, his face unburdened by command, laughing freely with an older man who clearly was his father. There was a stack of letters tied with rough twine, bearing the postmark of a small, isolated school in the east, letters written in a neat, youthful hand. And then, she found the picture that made her pause. It was a photograph of a woman with vibrant red hair and a kind, laughing face, a woman who looked strikingly similar to Caleb. She was holding a small, silver locket, standing in front of the very fireplace in that hidden room. She picked up the locket from the mantelpiece. It was tarnished, bearing a single, intricate engraving of a rose that had been broken in half. Just then, a heavy door creaked open, and Caleb stood silhouetted against the light. He hadn't seen her. His head was down, and he was holding a heavy ledger. When he finally looked up and saw her standing in a small, intimate space, holding the locket, his composure crumbled completely. The ledger slipped from his grasp, hitting the thick rug with a muffled thud. The confession and the vulnerability. His storm-colored eyes were immediately clouded with pain, a raw, exposed vulnerability that shocked Elara more than any show of aggression. "Don't touch that," he commanded, his voice rough, but there was no power in it, only a desperate plea. Elara slowly placed the locket back down. Who was she? Caleb walked into the room, his movements stiff. He closed the door behind him, sealing them both inside the memory. "My sister Maeve," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She was the only one who didn't see me as just a force of nature or a ruthless buyer. She saw the man. He pointed to the photograph. She loved this place. She died 5 years ago. An accident. But the life of the ranch, the responsibility, it killed the light in her too. She was supposed to take over. She was the rightful heir, the true soul of this land. And the rose? Elara asked softly, pointing to the broken engraving. It was her favorite. She broke it just before she died. She told me she felt the pressure of the thorn name was going to break her too. He looked at Elara, a profound sorrow filling his gaze. She was the wrong that I still regret. And I am the necessary, Elara finished for him, the words no longer accusatory, but laced with a new, complex understanding. Yes, Caleb admitted, lowering his head. I didn't take a wife because I wanted love, Elara. I took a wife because I needed a shield. A strong hand to run this house and a stable future to protect Maeve's memory and this land from those who would just exploit it. He finally looked at her, and the intensity was different now. It was a shared burden, not a challenge. You saved your father, Elara, but you also saved this. He gestured around the small room. You gave me the capacity to fight for the whole valley. You are more than a contract. You are a partner in necessity. Elara finally saw the truth. Caleb Thorne wasn't just a powerful man. He was a deeply lonely man, suffocated by the weight of a legacy he hadn't chosen, trying desperately to prevent a tragedy he had already witnessed. As she stood there, looking into the eyes of the man who had bought her freedom with his burden, Elara felt the hard shell around her heart finally crack. The fear was still there, but it was mixed with the disturbing, confusing flicker of pity, and perhaps the faintest outline of a strange, necessary kinship. She had traded one cage for another, but perhaps, in this golden cage, she wasn't entirely alone. The final term of their contract, the heir, still loomed, a mountain they had yet to climb. But for the first time since their wedding, Elara knew that when the moment came, they would face it not as buyer and sold, but as two desperate souls bound by a shared, terrible necessity.